Stand up right now if you can, just for 10 seconds. And if you can't stand, flex your ankles up and down a few times while you sit there. Feel that? That small pull in your calf. That's not nothing. That is one of the most underrated pieces of machinery in the entire human body doing its job in real time. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what it's doing, why it only really works properly when you walk, and why doctors have a name for what happens when it stops working. They call it the second heart. This isn't a video telling you walking is magic, or that 10,000 steps will add a decade to your life. I'm not going to give you a number I can't back up. What I am going to do is show you the actual physical mechanism inside your legs right now that no yoga pose, no stationary bike, and no set of dumbbell curls can fully replace. By the end of this, you'll be able to explain to your spouse, your kids, or your doctor exactly why your ankles swell on long car rides, why standing up too fast makes you dizzy, and why walking specifically, not exercise in general, is doing something almost surgical to fix both problems. Let's start with the plumbing problem your body was never built to solve any other way. Your heart is an incredible pump, but it only really excels at one direction of the job, pushing blood out and down. Arterial pressure does that part beautifully. Gravity helps. Getting blood back up from your feet against gravity all the way to your chest. That's a much harder engineering problem, and your heart alone was never designed to solve it. Evolution solved it with a second system, one most people have never heard of, built entirely out of muscle and one-way valves, sitting quietly in your calves. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly. Inside your lower legs, mainly in the soleus muscle. That flat muscle beneath your calf, the one that doesn't bulge like the gastrocnemius above it, but does far more of the daily work. There's a dense network of veins. These veins are lined, every few centimeters, with tiny one-way valves like little trapdoors. When you contract that muscle, by pushing off the ground while walking, the muscle squeezes those veins the way you'd squeeze a tube of toothpaste. Blood gets forced upward. The valve behind it slams shut so the blood can't fall back down. Squeeze, shut, all the way up the leg. Vascular physiologists have a specific name for this structure, the soleus muscle pump, sometimes called the peripheral heart, because functionally, that's exactly what it is. Now here's the rehook, because this is the part that should genuinely bother you a little. That pump only fires properly with the specific loading pattern of walking. Heel strike, roll through the arch, push off the toes, repeat. Standing still doesn't trigger it. Sitting doesn't trigger it. Even a lot of gentle range of motion exercises you might do sitting in a chair barely trigger it, because the muscle needs to bear your actual body weight and rhythmically contract and release over and over at a walking cadence for the trapdoor valve system to do its real work. So picture the two of us standing in an airport line for 40 minutes. Nothing dramatic is happening to your health in that moment, but physically, blood is pooling in your lower legs because the soleus pump isn't firing. Pressure builds in the small veins. Fluid gets pushed out of the capillaries into the surrounding tissue. That's why your ankles look puffier by the end of a long flight or a long day standing at a counter. It's not retaining water in some vague, mystical sense. It's a direct, mechanical, measurable consequence of a pump sitting idle. This is where it gets interesting for anyone over 50, because two things happen with age that make this pump even more important, not less. First, the valves themselves can weaken over decades. This is literally what varicose veins are, valves that no longer seal completely, letting blood leak backward and pool, which vascular surgeons diagnose using Doppler ultrasound precisely by watching for that backward leak. Second, the walls of your veins lose some elasticity with age, the same way skin does, so they don't spring back as efficiently between muscle contractions. That means the muscle pump isn't just helpful as you get older. It's compensating for hardware that's degrading elsewhere in the system. Let's go one layer deeper, because swollen ankles are the visible symptom, not the real story. When blood pools in your lower legs instead of returning to your heart receives less blood to pump back out. Physiologists call this reduced venous return, and it directly affects something called preload, which is simply how full your heart's chambers are right before they contract. Less preload means less blood gets pushed out with each beat. Your brain, sensing that blood pressure dipping, especially the moment you stand up, has to scramble. Nerves in your carotid artery and aorta called baroreceptors fire a signal to tighten blood vessels and speed up your heart rate to compensate. When that compensation is sluggish, which becomes more common with age, you get that head spin, that gray-out feeling when you stand too fast off the couch. Doctors call it orthostatic hypertension, and it's one of the more common, under-discussed reasons older adults fall. Here's the thing most people get wrong about that dizzy spell. They blame it entirely on blood pressure medication, or dehydration, or just getting older. Those all matter. But an underused calf pump is a genuinely modest, additive piece of that same puzzle. Not the whole explanation, but a real contributor, because a leg that's been sitting still for hours has less blood ready to return the moment you stand, which means your baroreceptor reflex has to work that much harder, that much faster, to catch up. Now, a callback to that airport line. If you'd gotten up and walked even the length of the terminal once every hour, that Soleus pump would have cleared the pooled blood, restored more normal venous return, and made the sudden stand-up moment far less dramatic for your baroreceptors to manage. That's not speculation about some mystical energy flow. That's straightforward circulatory mechanics, the same physiology taught in first-year medical school. This is also where I want to be honest with you about something, because a science video that oversells itself isn't worth your time. The connection between calf pump activity and fall prevention through better orthostatic tolerance is physiologically plausible and consistent with what we know about venous return and baroreceptor function. But it hasn't been isolated and proven in a clean standalone trial the way, say, vaccine efficacy has been tested. What is firmly established, sitting in vascular physiology textbooks and confirmed repeatedly with Doppler ultrasound, is that the Soleus muscle pump measurably increases venous return during walking versus standing still. That part isn't up for debate. The size of its downstream effect on falls is the honest, unresolved edge of the story. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why this particular problem is so distinctly human. Most four-legged animals don't face nearly the same challenge with venous return because their hearts and lower limbs sit roughly at the same height, and gravity doesn't have to fight nearly as long a vertical column of blood to get it back to the chest. Once our ancestors stood upright, permanently, on two legs, the distance blood had to travel straight up against gravity from the feet to the heart roughly doubled compared to a typical four-legged posture. Comparative anatomists studying bipedalism have long pointed out that this postural shift is exactly the kind of change that would put unusual, sustained pressure on the venous and lymphatic return systems of the legs, which lines up with why humans, uniquely among primates, develop conditions like varicose veins and dependent ankle swelling so commonly, while our quadrupedal relatives largely don't. In other words, the same evolutionary leap that freed our hands and let us build tools and civilizations also handed us this specific plumbing problem and walking. The very same upright motion that created the problem turns out to be the built-in solution evolution paired with it. Doctors also have an external, artificial version of this same mechanism, and comparing the two makes the internal one easier to picture. Compression stockings, the kind often prescribed after surgery or for chronic venous insufficiency, work by applying steady, graduated pressure from ankle to knee, squeezing the veins from the outside to help push blood upward and prevent pooling. They're a genuinely useful medical tool, and they help patients who can't yet walk much. But notice what they can't do that your own calf muscle can. They don't actively pump. They apply constant pressure, not a coordinated squeeze-release rhythm timed to a valve system. Your own calf muscle, contracting and relaxing with every step, is doing something more sophisticated than an elastic stocking ever could. It's an active, rhythmic pump, not a passive compression sleeve, which is part of why the stocking is described by vascular specialists as a supplement to activity, never a replacement for it. Let's go further down the chain, because there's a second consequence of stagnant blood that matters even more at this age, and it's the one vascular doctors worry about the most. When blood pools and moves sluggishly in a vein for long enough, it creates conditions where clotting factors in the blood, proteins that are supposed to activate only at the site of an actual injury, can start to aggregate where they shouldn't. This is one leg of what's called Virchow's triad, a framework the 19th century pathologist Rudolf Virchow described for how blood clots form, built on three ingredients: damage to the vein wall, a change in the clotting chemistry of the blood, and this is the one we're talking about: stasis, meaning blood that isn't moving. A deep vein thrombosis, a clot forming in one of the large veins deep in the calf or thigh, is a direct, well-documented consequence of prolonged stasis, which is exactly why hospitals put compression devices on the legs of patients who are bedridden after surgery, and why airlines now openly recommend getting up and moving on long flights. That recommendation isn't wellness marketing. It's a direct application of the same Soleus pump mechanism we just walked through. So far we've talked about the pipes, the veins and their valves, wearing down with age. But the engine driving the whole pump can weaken too, and that's a separate, additional fact worth knowing. Starting around our 40s and accelerating further after 60, we experience a gradual, measurable loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength, a process researchers call sarcopenia. The soleus muscle isn't exempt from this. A soleus that has lost some of its bulk and contractile strength doesn't squeeze the veins beneath it with the same force it did decades earlier, even if the valves themselves were perfectly healthy. Which means the calf muscle pump ejection fraction we just talked about can decline for two separate reasons layered on top of each other: weaker valves and a weaker muscle doing the squeezing. Here's the useful flip side of that fact. Skeletal muscle, including the soleus, responds to regular load-bearing use at any age. Research on resistance and weight-bearing activity in older adults has repeatedly shown that muscle can partially rebuild strength well into your 70s and 80s. Walking, because it's rhythmic, weight-bearing, and directly loads that exact muscle thousands of times per session, is one of the more accessible ways to keep that specific engine from losing power in the first place. There's a second fluid system running alongside your veins that most people have never even heard of, and it depends on this same muscle pump even more completely than blood does. It's called the lymphatic system, and its job is to drain excess fluid, proteins, and immune cells out of your tissues and eventually return them to your bloodstream. Here's the detail that surprises most people. Your lymphatic system has no pump of its own at all. Your heart gives blood a head start with every beat, but lymph fluid has nothing pushing it except the squeeze of surrounding muscles and, again, one-way valves almost identical in principle to the ones in your veins. That means lymph flow is, if anything, more dependent on walking than venous return is, because it has zero backup system. This is part of why ankle and lower leg swelling can come from two overlapping sources at once: sluggish venous return and sluggish lymphatic drainage, both solved by the same mechanical squeeze, both stalled by the same stillness. There's also a specific measurement vascular labs actually use for all of this, and knowing it exists helps make the whole idea feel less abstract. It's called the calf muscle pump ejection fraction. Technicians measure it using a method called air plethysmography, essentially a pressure cuff that tracks how much blood volume gets expelled from the lower leg with a single calf contraction. In healthy, active legs, that ejection fraction is robust. In legs affected by long-term inactivity or by valve damage from aging or prior clotting, that ejection fraction measurably drops. The pump is physically there, but it's working less efficiently, squeezing out a smaller volume with each contraction. This is one of the few places where your circulation is out of shape isn't just a figure of speech. It's a number a vascular technician can actually print out on a report. I want to pause here for 1 second, because if any of this is landing for you, if you've noticed your own ankles swelling by evening or that light-headed moment standing up, tell me in the comments which one you've actually experienced, because I read those, and it helps me know what to dig into deeper in future videos. Then let's get back into the science. So far we've been talking about the vein side of the loop, blood coming back up, but walking is doing something to the artery side too, and this is where the metaphor of a second heart earns its name even more literally. Every time your foot strikes the ground, a shockwave of pressure travels up through your leg. Researchers studying arterial health, including work coming out of exercise physiology labs, looking at what's called shear stress, the frictional force of blood dragging along the inner lining of your arteries, have shown that this rhythmic pulsing during walking stimulates the endothelium, the single-cell thick lining of your blood vessels, to release more nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a signaling gas, discovered to have this vascular role by researchers including Robert Furchgott, Louis Ignarro, and Ferid Murad, work that earned them the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1998. Nitric oxide relaxes the smooth muscle in artery walls, allowing them to widen slightly and improving blood flow. This effect from a single walk is real, but modest and temporary. It fades within a matter of hours, which is exactly why the benefit isn't a one-time fix, but something that depends on repetition, day after day, the same way brushing your teeth once doesn't keep them clean forever. Here's the part most people miss about that nitric oxide effect, and it's a genuinely different fact from the one before it. A single walk produces an acute, short-lived rise. But when that sheer stress stimulus repeats day after day, something more durable builds on top of it. Vascular researchers measure this using a test called flow-mediated dilation. Inflating a cuff around the arm or leg, releasing it, and using ultrasound to measure how much the artery widens in response to the sudden rush of blood. Studies using this exact test, including work summarized by exercise physiologists such as Frank Booth, have repeatedly found that people who walk regularly show better flow-mediated dilation at rest, months into a walking routine, compared with sedentary people of similar age, meaning the artery lining itself becomes somewhat more responsive over time, not just spiked temporarily after one session. This chronic version of the effect is still modest in absolute size, and it can partially decline again if the walking stops, but it's a genuinely separate layer from the same-day nitric oxide spike we just described. Notice what's happening here. We started with a swollen ankle you can literally see in the mirror. We went one layer down to valves and pressure gradients you can't see, but can definitely feel as dizziness. We went another layer down to clotting chemistry you'd only discover in a hospital scan. And now we're at the level of a single gas molecule being released by a single layer of cells lining your arteries, all triggered, at every level, by the same repetitive, weight-bearing, heel-to-toe motion of walking. That's the through line, not 5 different habits. One motion, one mechanism, unfolding at 5 different scales of your body. Let's zoom out to what this actually means for your daily life at this stage. Because mechanism without consequence is just trivia. In 2019, a research team led by Ayman Lee at Harvard, published in JAMA Internal Medicine, followed a group of over 16,000 older women, average age around 72, tracking their daily step counts with wearable devices and then following their health outcomes over the following years. What they found was that women who walked more steps per day had a lower mortality rate over the following years compared with those who walked the fewest. And importantly, the benefit showed diminishing returns, meaning you didn't need to hit some enormous, punishing number of steps to see the association. Moderate increases mattered too. That study can't prove walking alone caused the difference, because people who already feel healthier tend to walk more in the first place. That's a limitation researchers call reverse causation, and a responsible study author will always flag it. But it's one of the more carefully conducted studies we have connecting real-world step counts, not lab treadmill tests, to real-world outcomes in older adults specifically. Here's the honest calibration I promised you earlier, laid out plainly, now that you've heard the full chain. Strongly established, no real controversy. Walking activates the Soleus muscle pump, which measurably increases venous return compared to standing or sitting, and this can be directly quantified in a vascular lab using plethysmography. This is basic, repeatedly confirmed physiology, not a theory. Established but modest. A single walking session triggers a temporary rise in nitric oxide and a temporary improvement in arterial flexibility, an effect that fades within hours and depends on repetition. And separately, regular walking over weeks to months is associated with better flow-mediated dilation at rest, though this too is a modest shift, not a transformation. Also well established. Skeletal muscle, including the soleus, can partially rebuild strength with consistent load-bearing use even in older age, countering some of the natural decline from sarcopenia. Associated but not proven causal. Higher daily step counts in older adults correlate with lower mortality in large observational studies, though the size of the true causal effect separate from reverse causation, is still debated among researchers. Physiologically plausible, but not directly isolated in a controlled trial. That improved venous return and lymphatic drainage from regular walking meaningfully reduces fall risk through better orthostatic tolerance, or meaningfully lowers real-world clotting risk outside of hospital or immobility settings. I'd rather tell you exactly where that line sits than pretend the whole thing is equally rock solid, because the parts that are rock solid are honestly impressive enough on their own. Now let's talk about why walking specifically does this better than most other activities people substitute in, because this is the detail that gets skipped in almost every fitness video. Swimming is wonderful for your joints and your cardiovascular system, but you're horizontal and buoyant. There's very little of that heel strike, weight-bearing pressure wave traveling up your leg, and much less gravitational challenge to your venous system, because water pressure is already doing some of the compressive work externally instead of your muscles doing it internally. Cycling engages big muscle groups and is fantastic for the heart and lungs. But the pedaling motion is a smoother, more continuous contraction rather than the sharp squeeze and release rhythm of a footstep, so the valve-based pumping action is different in character. Stretching and gentle mobility work are genuinely valuable for flexibility and balance, but without body weight loading through the foot and repeated ground impact, you don't get the same shear stress stimulus on the artery lining or the same rhythmic compression on the calf veins. None of this means those activities are bad. They're excellent for other things. It means walking is doing a specific, particular job that those activities simply weren't built to replicate, because it's the one movement pattern your circulatory system evolved around for roughly 2 million years of upright, bipedal life, long before treadmills or swimming pools existed. There's one more layer worth knowing before we get to what to actually do with all this, because it explains why a slow shuffle still counts, even if it doesn't feel like real exercise. The Soleus pump doesn't care how fast you're moving. It cares whether the muscle is going through a full contract and release cycle. A typical walking cadence, even an unhurried one, takes the calf through that full squeeze roughly once per step, which over the course of even a short walk adds up to hundreds of individual pumping cycles. Compare that to standing still, where the muscle might not meaningfully contract at all for the entire 40 minutes. This is part of why physical therapists working with post-surgical or bed-bound patients will often start them not with brisk walking, but with simple ankle pumps, flexing the foot up and down rhythmically while lying in bed. Because what matters to the vein underneath isn't speed or distance, it's repetition of that specific squeeze. Walking simply happens to be the version of that same motion your body performs thousands of times a day, without a chart, a schedule, or a physical therapist standing over you. So let's turn this into something you can actually use today, because understanding the mechanism is only half the point. First, if you sit for long stretches, at a desk, in a car, on a plane, in front of the television, get up and walk for roughly 2 to 3 minutes every 30 to 60 minutes. This isn't about burning calories. It's specifically about re-triggering the Soleus pump before blood has had time to pool and pressure has had time to build in those calf veins. You don't need speed. Even a slow shuffle around the room activates the same contract and release valve action we talked about. Second, if you notice ankle swelling by the end of the day, a short walk in the late afternoon, even 10 minutes, before you sit down for the evening, can help clear some of that pooled fluid mechanically, the same way the compression devices in hospitals do it artificially. It won't cure swelling caused by heart failure or kidney disease. Those need a doctor's attention, and I want to be very clear that persistent, one-sided, or painful swelling is a signal to get checked, not walked off. But for the ordinary, mechanical, end-of-day puffiness most people experience, a short walk is directly targeting the actual physical cause. Third, if you've noticed dizziness standing up from sitting or lying down, try walking in place or marching your knees up for 30 seconds before you actually stand. This pre-activates the calf pump and gets some blood moving back upward before your baroreceptors have to scramble to compensate for a sudden postural change. This is a small, mechanical trick, not a cure for a diagnosed blood pressure condition, and if the dizziness is severe, frequent, or comes with chest pain or fainting, that's a conversation for your doctor, not a video. Fourth, and this is the one people underestimate the most, consistency matters more than distance. Because that nitric oxide effect fades within hours. A 15-minute walk today and another tomorrow is doing more for your artery lining, cumulatively, than one long hour-long walk once a week. The mechanism rewards repetition, not intensity. Fifth, and this one is easy to overlook because it's about footwear rather than the walk itself. The Soleus pump only gets a full squeeze if your ankle actually bends through its full range with each step, rolling from heel to toe. A stiff-soled shoe, or a heel that's noticeably raised, shortens that range of motion and gives the muscle less distance to contract through, which means a smaller, weaker squeeze on the veins underneath it. This doesn't mean you need special equipment. It means a flatter, more flexible shoe lets the mechanism we've spent this whole video describing actually complete its full stroke. Let's go back to that 10 seconds at the very start, standing up and feeling that pull in your calf. What you felt was a pump, a real, physical, one-way valve system built into your own legs, doing a job your heart was never fully equipped to do alone, pulling blood back up against gravity, squeeze by squeeze, step by step. It's been running quietly in the background of every walk you've ever taken, completely unnoticed, since the very first time you learned to stand upright as a toddler. And it turns out that small, unglamorous system is one of the more honest explanations for why the simplest, oldest movement your species ever learned is still, after everything modern fitness science has invented, one of the hardest things to fully replace. We spend so much energy searching for the next advanced, complicated, expensive way to protect our health as we age, and it turns out one of the most quietly powerful mechanisms was built into the bottom half of our own legs the whole time, waiting for us to simply use it the way it was designed to be used. The same upright posture that let our species reach, build, and create also left us with this one very specific plumbing problem tucked inside our own calves, and, almost poetically, handed us the exact motion that solves it, built into the same legs, requiring no device, no membership, and no instruction manual beyond the one your body already knows. Sometimes the most sophisticated thing your body does isn't hidden in some rare supplement or some intense new regimen. Sometimes it's hiding in the most ordinary motion you make 1,000 times a day without a single thought. And now, every time you take that motion, you'll know exactly what it's quietly doing for you underneath.